Good morning. Um, it's, it's a pleasure and a privilege to welcome all of you. And I stand on the behalf of a very large consortium of people. So it would be a misnomer to say I'm the host. I'm just the face today and only for the morning. For those of you who joined us yesterday in Amsterdam for the opening plenary, you know how exciting the stakes have already become because we have talked about questions of vandalism, questions of cuteness, questions of safety, questions of the post-truth, questions of too much truth, too little truth, and we're going to try and figure and unpack all of it in the next 2 days. When the coordinating team told me that I should do like an opening speech, I actually felt really embarrassed because there are so many people in this room who I would prefer to listen to rather than talk to right now. But welcome to ArtEZ. Welcome to this 2-day symposium, which kind of kickstarted yesterday. And I'm going to try and stick to time. In 30 minutes, try and figure out and answer one simple question, which is why did post-truth become urgent, right? And in order to talk about it, I'm going to go back to a historical form, which was in fact discussed obsessively almost yesterday evening, which is the book. I always thought that all conversations around the post-truth would be about machine learning, artificial intelligence, digital cycles, and platforms. But it seems like we still haven't escaped the aura of the book, which is very convenient for me because that's also what I want to talk about. But before I do that, I just want a show of hands. How many people here have seen me before? All right. So for those of you who have never seen me before, how do you know that I am in fact the Nishant Shah who's on the bill and is supposed to come and speak to you right now? Right? I find that question not just as a rhetoric, but because a very strange thing happened to me when I was visiting South Korea a couple of years ago, where I landed at the airport. I had no clue. I don't speak a word of Korean. There was supposed to be a cab driver with my name who was supposed to pick me up, and then there was somebody with my last name Shah. And so I just followed him. He spoke no English, I spoke no Korean. I got into the cab, and then I landed up in a place which I wasn't supposed to be because he was waiting for some other Shah, who also happened to be a Middle Eastern woman. But he still, because I claimed him with my ID saying I'm Shah, he just decided to carry me forward, right? This anxiety about claiming truth or about verifying information is something that I want to stick with in trying to think about why did post-truth become urgent at all? Because there is something about making a truth claim that is inherently anxiety-inducing in almost all our transactions. That our capacity to tell the truth is mediated by different notions of who's saying it, who's listening to it, who's endorsing it, and who validates the meanings that are produced from it. So in truth-telling is an anxiety, because the minute somebody claims something as true, it introduces a potential crisis that it might also be untrue, right? The claim of truth-telling necessarily comes with an inherent crisis of the untruth being embedded within that, or that it might be fake, or post-truth, or in fact, as the Trump administration calls it, an alternative fact, right? And this is not a new phenomenon. So if you look at just the history of writing and criticism, Philip Sidney, who is a 16th century British poet and artist, once talked about how the poet never lieth because the poet never affirmeth that he says the truth, right? Art never claims to be truthful, and hence it can never lie, Sidney said. So these questions of truthiness have kept on cropping up in many different forms in our contemporary practices of informationality. And I'm going to begin my talk with 3 kind of very snapshot stories from the contemporary, beginning with the digital and then going back historically. The first story that I wanted to talk to you about is about an artificial intelligence software which wrote a novel in Japan. The AI was developed by somebody called Hitoshui Matsubura and his team at Future University at Hakadote in Japan. And it was incidentally nominated for Japan's highest literary prize in 2016. It was in the final shortlist of 3. The title of the novel is Konpyu Tago Shoetsu wa Kakahui, The Day a Computer Writes a Novel. And the blind jury accepted it as a human creation. And it was only when they contacted the person who said, I'm not an author, I'm merely a programmer, that things became really interesting. The novel did not really win a prize later on. But there is this amazement that we have that storytelling, which is a creative exercise, can now also be a machine exercise. That we do, in fact, work constantly with things like big data algorithms which tell stories. So all of us who have Netflix and are looking at Netflix productions, we know, for example, that half of the original Netflix productions are actually scripted by AI decisions. Right? What happens to a plot point? What happens to a camera? There are certain formulae which are kind of being derived from shows that are extremely popular, and then they become reproduced in multiple ways across all the things that we are taught to consume. So if you think that your Netflix recommendations are really, really good, it basically means that the algorithm knows precisely what is the kind of things that you like to see, and then that's the only thing that it shows you, right? Or it tries to do that. So there is a certain way by which you are thinking about now narratives and cultural productions which we always thought were human agency, even when technologically mediated, which are continuously being complicated by our conditions of the algorithmic. So even as we kind of get amazed by creative storytelling, there are other forms of storytelling which are fascinating. I don't know if anybody spends time on Twitch. Yeah? Or at least some people? Okay, that makes me feel like a little less of a loser. Because Twitch is this fantastic forum where you see other people playing games, right? So I'm basically so lazy that I don't even play games. I just watch other people playing games and listen to their commentary. But possibly the biggest payoff that came out of watching and spending time on Twitch was this particular conversation that was relayed in 2017, where somebody decided to make two Google Home Assistants start speaking to each other. And it was about a 1 hour long recording where the two basically started a live transcript which was going on, and all kinds of strange things happened. The bots started asking really strong philosophical questions of, am I human, or am I just a bot who has woken up to believe that it is a human? Then one of them decided to be a man, the other decided to be a woman. One called himself Vladimir, the other called herself Estragon. Then they decided that they don't like being male and female, so they switched roles, and one other became male and one became female. I'm like, Virginia Woolf's Orlando is so old-fashioned, right? Like, it's no longer a shock anymore. One of them, of course, one of the male ones actually fell in love with the female ones. Then it started writing really, really bad poetry. Then the female bot got bored and started talking about American Super Bowl. The male bot was depressed. It questioned the existence of God. And the human world following the exchange was cheering and laughing and crying and booing the main characters of this soap opera, which was unfolding entirely out of apparent scripting, right? And while this was happening, somewhere in Facebook's artificial intelligence lab, two AI softwares called Bob and Alice, who were programmed to reach a negotiation about how to solve a logistical problem when there are too many variables or involved, had started to invent their own language. So two AI softwares which were basically designed saying there is complex logistical decision making and you need to work together to form a consensus. Basically Dutch culture. Right? And what this very, very quickly realized was that human language is absolutely impossible to make decisions in. And they started, in fact, developing their own language, which is completely made out of mathematical symbols, because that was much easier for them to operate. It reached a point where the designers of the AI started getting really scared because they could no longer understand what these AIs were doing. So Facebook decided to just pull the plug on the AI and kill them. Because it looked like this is all of our science fiction nightmares coming true, right? Like the machines are finally going to take over. And the third story I have from you is from India, some of the work that we've been doing around fake news and alternative facts in India for the last 3 years, where in summer of 2018, in a small village in the state of Karnataka, a whole village started receiving messages that there are going to be outsiders, which was code for, in the language that they were using, it was code for Muslims, that there are Muslims who are going to come and traveling across the state, and they are kidnapping young girls and taking them away. Right? The community was in a state of frenzy as different videos claiming to be acts of kidnapping or killing or organ harvesting circulated like wildfire in the span of 1 day. Everybody was on the edge. And that's when 4 friends traveling through the village stopped and asked for directions from some schoolgirls who were playing by the road. Somebody saw them, and in 10 minutes, a lynch mob of 2,000 people, orchestrated entirely just by WhatsApp, came across these 4 men and started beating them up. 3 of them escaped, one were badly injured, and one of them actually died because of this. When the police came to investigate the death case, people repeatedly said that they had received the news from WhatsApp, that they were acting on the message sent by this big company, which would obviously only send them correct information. Right? That the message was not just being sent to them by a friend, but it's being sent by WhatsApp, which they treat almost like as any other news company, which is going to broadcast information either on the radio or the television. These cases have become so big that WhatsApp is now trying to do skits. It makes rap videos in India. It takes out huge newspaper advertisements educating people that when a message comes on WhatsApp, it's not coming from WhatsApp. It's coming from sources that we cannot verify. So in all of these 3 incidents, right, of an AI writing novels, of bots falling in love, and of people believing information without verifying, are the seeds of how truth has been constructed in information systems. That the post-truth problem that seems to be new has a much larger historical context and a cultural dimension, and that I'm going to try and see how in another historical moment when the book and the print media was coming around, some of these questions were prevalent, and then how they were resolved in different fashions. And in order to do that, I'm going to take you through extremely embarrassing personal stories, beginning with how once I wrote my first book and what happened in that. So I was 14 in 1994. In India, I grew up near the desert where the temperatures get really high in the summer, so it's like 50 degrees, right? So basically, I spent all my time in the summer sitting in libraries. And I had a close bunch of friends who basically bonded on the fact that we loved books. So by the time I was a teenager, I had come to love books quite intensely. I knew that books could make me laugh, they could make me cry, they could infuse in me a sense of danger and adventure. They could keep me mellow and enchanted for hours. But in the summer of '94, which doesn't sound as cool as Bryan Adams' songs, but my friends and I discovered something else that books could do. And not to make a big point of it, but we discovered this incredible book called Letters to the Penthouse in the health and science section in the public library. Now, how that book got there, what visionary librarian ordered it, and how it continued to kind of stay in the library is a mystery that we haven't been able to unravel, right? But for 5 hormonal teenage boys without access to the internet, we never even heard of it at that point. The discovery of a book which is written by adults describing their most sexual and morbid fantasies was like the finding of paradise. So our first instinct, of course, was to issue the book and never return it, because, that's what you do, except that the book was in the non-lending reference-only section of the library, which was because it makes sense, because a book that explains to you the ways by which you can seduce your stepbrother's aunt and speculated on what comes next should be right next to the chicken soul for the soup, right? Or chicken soup for the soul, sorry. So anyway, to come to the point, there we are. We had a book like we had never seen before and nowhere to take it to. So we spent the entire summer of '95, 5 of us, sitting down through long afternoons, copying the book sentence by sentence, word by word, in respectable-looking college notebooks, our tongues sticking out and our fingers stained with ink, running to the bathrooms when the task became very unmanageable. It took us the better part of 10 weeks to copy the entire book, and what we had at the end of those 10 weeks were 5 different sections of the book, each written by a separate person, ready to be circulated for the sheer joy of reading. What we didn't realize then was that we were apparently following in the footsteps of famous scribes of the 12th and 13th century in England, who actually used to perform a similar task with the Holy Book, translating it, transcribing it, copying it, and circulating it. And as scribes, we also realized that this act of copying is not really an act of slavish imitation. It is, in fact, an act of authorship. Because as we copied, we added our own content to those fantasies. Sometimes it was content that was in the expression of the desire at the level of content. Sometimes it was content that was indicative of the emotional state that we wrote in, right? The jerkiness of the handwriting when things became very heated. The half-written sentence, the pause taken in the middle of a word that was too racy. And as the text circulated, we added, edited, annotated, and remixed the content over the next 5 years of growing up. At the end of, by the time I was ready to graduate from school, our modest book which had originally been 280 pages, had already circulated among 400 people in the school, and had grown into a 1,000-page epic of the dirtiest, smuttiest, most bizarre and fascinating collaborative porn ever in the hands of teenagers, right? Now, this book unfortunately fell in the hands of an extremely nosy teacher, and all hell broke loose. Because authority demanded that the writer of the book come forward and take the blame. Except that the condition of multiple authorship and anonymity, which was betrayed only by the idiosyncrasies of handwriting and syntax, made it impossible to identify just one author for this book. And so, after a series of blank wall investigations, the authority could not determine the authorship, could not solve the conundrum of who wrote our book, could not attribute it to one person, and they decided to take it out on the entire 10th grade, and none of us were allowed to go out to play in recess for like an entire year as punishment, and 600 people were punished to be responsible for this book, right? The need and production for an author, the figure of both cultural celebration and legal culpability, has been historically fascinating to trace in history. And one of our closest similarities, it turns out, was a good old man called Geoffrey Chaucer, apparently the father of modern English poetry. Mark Rose, who has the fantastic title of being a historian of reading, talks about how Geoffrey Chaucer, who kind of is the first modern language English writer. He writes this epic book called the Canterbury Tales, which partly survives in history. Rose points out that the Canterbury Tales has baffled historians of writing for a very, very long time, because every single chapter within the Canterbury Tales has a different stylistic device, different scansion, different metrical patterns, and different forms of writing. Right? How could one author write so many different kinds of narrative structures just in one book? Well, Mark Rose points out it happens because there was no such thing as a Geoffrey Chaucer. Right? Chaucer does not exist historically as a human person. In fact, Chaucer comes into existence because in 12th century Britain, two laws came into existence. One was the law against heresy, and the other was the law against blasphemy. The law against blasphemy essentially said that anything that is considered to be prurient, lascivious, or immoral will now be considered an offense to God and hence to king, and hence it's culpable in action. And the law against heresy said that you can basically only report immoral content if you are reporting on it. So you cannot be the original producer of it, but you can hear it, and because you need to either take it to confession or to the king, you can report what somebody said, and then you are exempt from that particular act of immorality, right? Which is why the Canterbury Tales, in fact, had a complete change in its prologue, because the Canterbury Tales, for those who are familiar with you, is a bartender who's listening to 19 people going on a pilgrimage and repeating what they are saying, so that there is no authenticity or authorship left within the text. Right? At the same time, the Canterbury Tales was written and edited by multiple people across multiple dimensions, and they just came together and gave the name of Geoffrey Chaucer to somebody, one person, who could be held accountable if things went very wrong. So that's the first kind of story around authorship and its relationship with truth claims, and how the author is often produced both as a legal as well as a fictitious entity to be housed within that. The second story I have, and this might be familiar to you, but this is about the youngest criminal on the internet recorded so far. This is the video of Holden Lenz. Let me see if I can play it for you. All right, so this is the face of the criminals on the internet. Holden was 13 months old when his mother Stephanie shot this video. This is the first time he was dancing, and because he was dancing, she took the video and in 2007 uploaded it on YouTube. The minute she put it on YouTube, the video was removed for copyright infringement. Because what you and I cannot hear, but an artificial intelligence algorithm is detecting, is that in the background, the music that is playing is Prince's Let's Go Crazy. and the rights are owned by Universal. And Universal Music has a pact with YouTube where any video that is uploaded is basically scanned by an AI to figure out if there is copyright music being used, and it immediately gets taken away. Stephanie, who couldn't believe it, kind of kept on re-uploading the video, thinking this is as harmless as it can get, and she wanted her parents to see the video. After she tried to do it 3 times, Universal, in fact, sued Holden Lens for copyright infringement. So the baby in the video, and along with his mother, Stephanie, for 1.2 million US dollars. The case was actually fought by colleagues at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and they eventually won the case. But it did talk about a very strange idea of what intellectual property has to do with questions of authenticity and in terms of who gets to own it. Because while this case was happening, there was another company which was in fact marketing itself as the creative tool for the creative industry because it allowed you to rip, burn, and mix. Right? Apple's entire placement, the reason why all of our art schools keep on insisting that Apple machines are the only ones which are good for doing any of our work, is precisely because Apple positioned itself as a creative tool with extraordinary processing power and sophisticated algorithms and softwares, which allowed for different kinds of remixing and intellectual property right infringement, in fact, to happen. Right? And while Apple was targeting this in Northern America and Northern Europe, they were doing something else in India. They were, in fact, coming to India and suggesting that India, which had one of the largest software piracy and cultural production piracy markets around that time, needed to clear out its house in order for intellectual property rights to get more stringent. So if you go to India or any other East Asian or South Asian countries, you will see that these shops with just pirated DVDs and CDs of everything that you can possibly imagine are always around, right? And Apple, along with a whole bunch of other lobbyists, who, by the way, formed a fascinating consortium called the Music and Film Industry Association. Without any sense of irony, the acronym is MAFIA. They came to the Indian government, and a part of its trade treaties insisted that the government has to enforce strong laws which stops the Indian population from ripping, burning, and mixing of digital content. And to make sure that the message comes really clearly, they said that the US at that point had developed a very, very low-cost drug to cure malaria. Malaria being the #1 disease that still kills people in India. It's not really HIV/AIDS, it's not diabetes, and it's not cancer and tuberculosis, it's still malaria. So the US had, in fact, at that point developed a very, very cheap drug which could cure and prevent malaria. And they held that at ransom, saying unless India has better intellectual property rights enforcement, which are influenced in the country, we will not allow you the rights of reverse engineering this drug, which might potentially save thousands, tens of thousands of lives in the country, right? And so there is certain thing about the question of authenticity. Who gets to be the authentic body of truth-telling, the subject who needs to be able to verify it and to be lived up in a certain way. And the last proposition in the story I have to you is about, the second one was about authority, about questions of who gets to authorize what kinds of bodies, and the last story I have for you is around authenticity, and trying to think about why the truth complex needs a certain notion of authenticity. Now, I'm presuming a lot of us are from the art worlds right now, and you know that authenticity is our holy grail, right? There are like entire people who have just made careers out of going around and saying that's authentic and that's not. Like that's more or less what their job is. And authenticity experts are the gatekeepers of what is true and what's not. From my home state in India, which is Gujarat, and there is the first language is Gujarati, which is the script that you can see on the poster here, comes a fascinating case of somebody called Ashwini Bhatt, who is a translator. Ashwini Bhatt writes in Gujarati, which is, it's spoken just largely in just one state of Gujarat, so it's not very big. It's only about 90 million people who speak it, so it's a very small kind of literary market. I know we are in the Netherlands. The global scales are different outside of this country, right? Ashwini Bhatt basically started translating the novels of John Gardner, right? Like this pulp fiction, legal kind of police procedural case drama. And he became a really huge success. Like he translated almost all of John Gardner's novels and was a huge success in the state. And one day, Bhatt, who is a prolific translator, ran out of John Gardner novels to translate. So then he tried out Sidney Sheldon, he tried out all the other people I don't read and I don't remember the names of, but Pulp Fiction writers, Daniel Steele. And he kind of tried all of them out, but the audience was not ready for it. They basically thought that Ashwini Bhatt is the only voice that suits him is the voice of John Gardner. So Bhatt kind of tries out about 4 or 5 different novels. And then, when it doesn't work out, he goes back to translating John Gardner. And in fact, here comes the strangeness, because he went on to translate 14 more novels by John Gardner, except that that's 14 more novels than John Gardner has written. Right? So he wrote original text in Gujarati, passing it off as a translation of the genre. Now, so while this was happening, the intellectual property rights owners of John Gardner novels sued Ashwini Bhatt for translating novels that did not exist at all. Right? And that was an interesting legal case which kind of came in. So I just wanted to kind of pin down these 3 stories about the instability of authority, authorship, and authenticity by bringing it back to the post-truth. That a lot of the times post-truth conversations focus on information, content, meaning, writing, interpretation, evidence. And while these smaller negotiations of information analysis are important, the post-truth has very little to perhaps do with it. That when we talk about the urgency in post-truth, it's not about the content or the information, but about thinking through structures of authorship, authority, and authenticity that the digital has started bringing into play. That we need to think about the structures of authorship, who writes us rather than what we write about ourselves, and what happens when that is a technological entity that's writing us. That we need to think through structures of authority, the ways in which some information is going to be packaged and produced, punished and penalized by those who have algorithmic authority and big data power to validate and control it. And we are witnessing the reworking of authenticity about who gets to decide what is an original, what is authentic, what gets dismissed, and what gets discounted. And I'm proposing that if we think through these 3 structures, we might have multiple genealogies and histories of truth-telling, truth relationship with information, and then its relationship with publishing and publishing strategies, which hopefully will be conversations that will be taken up throughout the day. So I will stop here right now and welcome once again to this very, very exciting conference. I'm looking forward to see how these conversations grow in the making. Thank you very much. Thank you.